Hello guys, my name is Mike, welcome back to the YouTube channel, and today we're checking out a different type of video from the YouTube channel Invicta in how to raise a medieval army. Hope you enjoy. So how to raise a medieval army. So I feel like in recent years with the dramatic rise and the dramatic fall of Game of Thrones and things like The Witcher, The King, The Outlaw King, I feel like media have kind of been pushing towards a more medieval or medievally inspired content. And I feel like people have been enjoying that. However, what media doesn't do is really kind of get across the idea of how medieval armies kind of work, how they're formed, just how they function, generally speaking. So I've headed to this video by Invicta. It popped up in my YouTube recommendations. Checked out Invicta before with the Spartan Laconicisms, and so this could be really good. I absolutely love the medieval period. I love learning about, you know, the Middle Ages and medieval times and things like that. I'm by no means an expert in it. Everything that I know is kind of self-taught, things that I've gone on holiday or visited and trips and things like this to kind of, you know, learning holidays or learning vacations for Americans out there. And practically everything that I know about this period is from my own interest. I've never studied it. However, I absolutely adore learning about it, and I hope you guys will too as we check out this video. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Pop cultural depictions of medieval or pseudo-medieval armies are extremely common in today's media. These armies are often either shown marching dramatically to the battlefield or are already deployed on it. In reality though, these sorts of armies didn't just materialize out of thin air. A small portion of media seem to understand this and provide at least a token explanation by having some general say the magic words that will do the trick. Call the banners, summon the elector counts, muster the Rohirrim. But this is usually just a plot convenience that ignores much of the realities of ancient warfare. In this video, we will discuss what it really took to raise a medieval army. If you'd like to manage your own medieval kingdom, you can do so through our sponsor, Crusader Kings 3. It's an incredible grand strategy game on the PC that lets you guide noble dynasties from realms across a massive historical map which stretches from Iceland to India and from the Arctic Circle to Central Africa. Engage in politics, diplomacy, trade, religion, espionage, and warfare as you reshape history. Knights, peasant revolts, pilgrimages, Viking raiders. Experience the drama and pageantry of the Middle Ages by clicking the link in the description below to get Crusader Kings 3.
Okay, so I know that was an advert. I've never actually played Crusader Kings 3. However, some people have suggested me potentially bringing gaming content to the channel, you know, historically gaming content perhaps. And I was just wondering if that's something that perhaps you guys might be interested in or enjoy or have some sort of feedback on. So like me, for example, playing Hearts of Iron 4. As trying to do like historically, but that kind of video will be a bit more edited down. It'd be me trying to do a bit more humor bits and things like this, heavily edited in comparison to my action videos, or things like perhaps the Total War series or things like this. Would that be something that you guys perhaps might be interested in, or perhaps as a community, perhaps getting a Discord together and having, you know, monthly or every other month or something like that, Hoy games or something like that together? If that's something that you guys might be interested in, then please let me know in the comments, and I'll see about potentially sorting that up. But without further ado, let's continue.
Before we begin, it must be stated that even our own in-depth video here will be filled with its own generalities and summarizations. This is a consequence of the fact that the medieval period in the popular imagination covers hundreds of years of history and an incredibly large geographical area. An army raised in the Eastern Roman Empire in the 8th century would look and function very differently to a 15th century French royal army. Therefore, this video is not intended to provide a complete understanding of how all medieval armies were raised and organized, but rather to provide a simplified look at the dynamics and structural factors behind the assembly of a typical medieval army of Western Europe, which is the basis of most media depictions.
Yeah, and the same goes for the info that I can kind of supply as well. My knowledge, obviously, again, as I said, is kind of just all that I've learned myself, and for that, the things that I'd be adding is usually probably more to do with England, Britain, or France. More so, just because that's what I'm more kind of knowledgeable about. But again, what I do say, take it with a pinch of salt as I'm generally speaking, because again, as you said, the medieval period spans several centuries, and something that was true at the start of the century or start of the medieval period could be completely different by the end of the medieval period. So take what I say and what this video says as a general sense rather than specific sense.
So what is a typical medieval army? Well, we can start to get a sense of things by looking at larger macro trends in military history. In the preceding era, Europe had witnessed a gradual consolidation of power under the Romans, who eventually developed standing professional forces. These legions were numerous, well-equipped, and well-trained as a result of the vast pool of resources that could be leveraged to sustain them. But as the Roman Empire fell into decline, power once again began to fracture and revert to the local level. This meant that military forces reverted from large bodies of professional standing troops to smaller groups of warriors organized around an individual aristocrat's household or by local communities, pooling their more limited resources to provide for their own defense. This structure of militaries lasted from the early medieval period to the late 15th and 16th centuries, when the more powerful Western European states developed the bureaucratic and financial apparatus necessary to raise and maintain larger professional standing forces. Thus, the typical medieval army at this time would usually number in the low thousands or even hundreds. This is in stark contrast to the massive forces from antiquity, where an estimated 100,000 soldiers participated in the famed Battle of Cannae, as opposed to the medieval Battle of Agincourt, which featured, at most, half that number.
Yeah, so I just want to touch on what he actually just said there as well, is obviously you have professional soldiers. So when we think of Rome or something like that, and also I am going to do some Roman videos in the future going forward on this channel, so don't worry about that if that's something that you want me to have a look at. But the thing is, after Rome, as we kind of know it, collapses, there isn't really a form of professional soldiers really until, as I said, 15th, 16th centuries. I'd argue they probably come way into the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly speaking for most countries. But as he said, the size of the armies is completely different as well. As he said, Cannae, 100,000. Some estimates, I think, put it as high as 130,000. The Battle of Zama is around 80 to 90,000, I think, between both armies. And obviously you have the Battle of Gargamella, who the original historians at the time estimated anywhere between like 250,000 to 1 million men that the Persians had. But obviously modern estimates still put that to 100 to between 100 and about 170,000, depending on who you're talking to. But even still, those are colossal numbers in comparison to what we're seeing on medieval fields. Medieval battlefields rather. And so obviously, there is that stark difference there that, when we think of, medieval battlefields and stuff like that, we'd like to think of, these tens of thousands of men clashing against each other. In reality, most warfare isn't actually pitched battles in the medieval period. It's skirmishes, it's raids and things like this, with the occasional siege or pitched battle. Pitched battles are more the exception rather than the norm. But perhaps this video will talk about this. We'll get into that later. Also, I have got subtitles on, but they're auto-generated, so apologies if some of the words are wrong to those of you who are not kind of native English speakers, but this is kind of the best that you can do, so hopefully they can help.
However, a more detailed discussion of this phenomenon will have to wait for another time. As for the composition of this typical medieval army, you would expect a core force made up of the armed household and retinue of the social elite. These generally had the best gear and might be either on foot or on horseback. Bolstering their ranks would be non-aristocratic freemen who could be called up for service when the need arose. Their gear would vary greatly, but was usually expected to at least meet some basic standards, which were often tied to legal obligations for the maintenance of arms based on their socio-economic status. And lastly would come the auxiliary forces, such as foreign allies or hired mercenaries, whose quality again would vary, but was probably at least high enough to warrant their inclusion in the army.
Okay, so just quickly there, because I just want to talk about, one, I'm actually just really happy that they haven't embraced the kind of this stereotype of the unwashed peasants making up armies and stuff like that. So in reality, in medieval times, as I said, particularly with England is what I'm talking about, but also with France, is feudal tenants generally performed the service required of them militarily according to kind of their fiefs or their property or their social kind of economic platform. So as you said, so you kind of have those who are physically fit but are also wealthy enough to kind of equip themselves, train themselves. These are your aristocrats, a bit like what they said. These are your nobility, your minor nobility, your knights, people who have influence in peacetime but are also kind of trained martially, are equipped in some of the best weapons and armor that money can buy, essentially, and that is kind of their role. And then, as they said, you have the freemen, and these kind of again were people who weren't aristocrats but had a level of income that allowed them to equip themselves with things. So this is where you could get your men at arms. Men at arms arguably could be considered freemen. These were people who could afford the same weapons and armor as knights but weren't aristocrats. And for those who were less wealthier but could still earn above a certain amount of income, I can't remember in England, but if you had a income above a certain threshold, you were required to have some degree of maintenance of arms, whether that be your equipment, whether that be your armor, whether that be your weapons, and a degree of military training. And then, of course, you have your mercenaries, which, as the title suggests, were kind of soldier for hire. And depending on where they were or what the specific mercenaries were, I mean, Swiss pikemen were renowned mercenaries. English longbowmen, when England wasn't at war, were very well sought after mercenaries. And particularly, mercenaries saw a huge amount of service in most medieval wars. I mean, King John absolutely loved using Flemish mercenaries, for example. But the Italian city-states as well, particularly, almost full armies comprising of mercenaries, depending on the period that you're talking about.
Notably missing from this description are the hordes of unwashed peasants with pitchforks you usually see depicted in pop culture. This is because such peasants were of little military value and would have imposed a heavy logistical burden. Better to leave them in the fields where they could be productive. Some peasants, however, did fight, either because their socio-economic status meant they were already subject to the levy obligations we previously mentioned, or because they rallied for local defense as a militia that had been armed by the community or by a rich individual. Again, however, we are speaking in generalities here, and these details would have varied by region and era.
Yeah, so I'm so happy that he's made this point about the peasantry, because in films and TV, looking at you, Braveheart, for one, you see these hordes of peasants just standing there completely, the unwashed peasants. They've got sticks, they've got pitchforks, they've got no armor, they're wearing like cloths, if they're wearing anything at all. And it's just like, yes, these are the people that we want going into battle for us. It's like, no. For one, obviously, yes, there were certain times in history where armies were certainly compromised more of kind of non-professionals or non-warriors than warriors. However, the idea that peasants in the form of the great unwashed with sticks, pitchforks, clubs were the norm is nonsense. Peasants, for one, are untrained in martial pursuits. Otherwise, you're just having lots of people whose role it is to be meat shields and to die, essentially, and serve no purpose. The problem with that, though, is these people need to be fed. They have needs that they need to be looked after. This causes an even more strain logistically, as the video stated, on the armies, because, it's not modern day where you have trucks and helicopters to gather supplies and bring them about and super kind of efficient farming methods. They don't have this here. So the more people you bring on campaign with you, the more people you need to feed, which causes more problems, because then you need more stuff to feed those people, and it just creates a wider issue. And obviously, the kind of element in the room, which again this video's kind of touched on, is the peasants are the people who grow the food, who make the food. There is no utility in getting the people who feed you killed. But what they said is some of the peasants, and this is right, did serve as a levy, as a militia program. And that's because as it said, these might be paid by a wealthy individual or the community and stuff like this. And the general way that it would work is you'd either have a wealthy kind of merchant class or something like that who, as part of his kind of service, would provide arms, armor, and stuff like this. Or more often, what you would have is a form of substitution. And these substitution would be those who are financially well off but aren't physically able to fight. So these would be your old, your infirm, women who inherited knights, or even members of the clergy who were in that financial position where they could afford arms, armor, training, things like this. They would have to pay a specific amount depending on their circumstance, which would go to the arming and the training and the recruitment of these kind of levies and these militiamen. And that's kind of where they would be drilled. And these militiamen as well in peace times would be also the type of people who would serve as watchmen, who would serve as guards. And the levies, who are part of this program, would be the type of people who then, at a certain time when war was occurred, could be called up to kind of join the campaign army. And, you know, this is no different to where we see in elsewhere. I mean, obviously the video is talking about generalities, and I'm talking about generalities, but I'm just trying to think, like in the 9th century, for example, the Franks, kind of modern day France, Germany kind of region, for those of you who don't know, kind of expected all 3 Franks to show up under military service. And now, technically speaking, these Franks were peasants. They made their livings off farms. However, they had seen military combat before, most of them. They had enough to arm themselves with both the best kind of weapons and armor that they could afford to their means, and they knew what they were doing. So in reality, although they were peasants, they were closer to being freemen, and that's more to do with what constituted a freeman under the Frankish Empire and things like that. But another example as well is 1066 with the Saxons. You know, the Saxons' core were the houseguards, the kind of the noblemen, the kind of the household kind of units of nobility and things like this. And these were professional soldiers, but the majority of the Saxon army were made up of thanes. And these were a land-owning class similar to freemen. So even back at 1066, you still had this kind of the same similar setup here going. And really, this would kind of be the way going forward. Obviously, there's differences in different countries, but I feel like on a general whole, that's kind of how the levy system and the kind of the rank structure, if you will, worked within a medieval society.
With this in context, let's now turn to the process of raising a medieval army. Our discussion will follow this chain of events. 1. Deciding to go to war. 2. The call to arms. 3. Mustering the troops. 4. Deployment for battle. As one might expect, something would always prompt the decision to go to war, whether or not it actually amounted to a valid casus belli. It will therefore be useful for us to spend a little time talking about the nature of medieval warfare and what might trigger a large-scale conflict. Simply put, warfare in the medieval period was quite common. As with the army sizes, however, its scope was rather reduced compared to antiquity. There was a far greater prevalence of low-level combat going on in the form of raiding and skirmishing than, for instance, the massed battles of Hollywood. For our purposes, however, we will be focused on the larger-scale wars, which did indeed occur, but were simply more rare. These conflicts could occur for all sorts of reasons, but often boiled down to the following issues: territorial expansion, often for control of valuable resources, such as land, which really is at the root of most conflicts. Political feuds, often involving claims to the throne, like the 100 Years' War. Holy wars, like the Crusades. And reconquest, like the Byzantine campaigns of Justinian. So let's say that one of these wars was brewing. How did the decision to pull the trigger come about? Well, we must understand that going to war was no light undertaking. Most rulers viewed large-scale war as a significant risk, both because of the great expense and the danger of defeat. Even attempts at raising armies that did not take the field could be ruinously expensive and crippling politically.
Yeah, so just to touch on briefly there is obviously, I'm not going to go into the causes of war specifically because otherwise those could practically be entire videos themselves. But yeah, mustering an army is incredibly expensive, and as such, wars, particularly for weaker reasons, as some might say, could often cause dissent among kind of the lower classes, usually because after the war had been fought, taxation would be raised or levied in some way that, you know, basically to afford them or to pay for them after the case, which, you know, taxation and stuff like this isn't very popular with people. But yeah.
Therefore, the lead up to war might take years or even decades to develop. Much of this time would have been spent marshalling the necessary resources and political capital for the undertaking. Despite the common view of kings as all-powerful dictatorial figures, they existed in an era of decentralized power and often lacked the personal resources and authority to take on the war effort alone. Rulers therefore had to make compromises and deals with other powerful bodies within the realm and beyond to achieve their aims. This negotiation process involved talks with aristocrats, religious authorities, diplomats, bankers, and consultative or legislative bodies such as the Imperial Diet of the Holy Roman Empire or the Parliament in England. The amount of politicking and negotiation needed to solicit support for a war was often dependent on the type of conflict being fought and the stakeholders involved. Broadly speaking, though, defensive wars were simpler matters. The logistical and financial burdens were relatively light, and the threat to one's own community was a powerful motivator. It's the offensive wars in foreign territory that were the real problem. These required much greater logistical and financial preparation, especially if they were conducted overseas. For instance, the debt accumulated by Richard the Lionheart during his many wars was massive, and the ransom for his capture alone is estimated to have cost 2 to 3 times the annual income of the crown. These financial hardships revealed the strained relationships between the king and his subjects.
Yeah, so just briefly there and again, what we were saying about the king. So in theory, the kings are absolute monarchs. They could do whatever they want. However, the reality to that is a different thing entirely, because as I said, kings generally within their own kind of household or within their own kind of retinue very rarely had the sums of money or the men to carry out these large-scale offensive wars should they need to. You know, the way the feudal system works is you have the monarch at the top, and then is a pyramid scheme almost, to coin the phrase, is you have the monarch right at the top, then you have the barons and upper nobility, then below them you have the kind of lesser nobility, then below them you have like knights and things like this, and then below them, and you know, that's society. And obviously the king at the very top holds supreme amount of power. However, he can only really achieve the things if the people beneath him kind of agree and stuff like that, because at the end of the day, the king can declare all the wars that he wants, but he still needs people to organise the types of taxes to be collected. He needs the logistics to be organised. He needs the men to be organised and gathered together. And that's not really something that he can practically do by himself. And that's why defensive wars, as I said, is a lot simpler, because it's defending your own land. Obviously, you don't need to pay extortionate fees because it's your own country that you're in, so you can just bill it and things like that in that sense. But offensive wars is when it gets more problematic, and that's when you have one of the causes of the first Barons' Revolt in England was when King John kept launching subsequent wars in France that weren't going well, and then coupled with that Magna Carta as well, which, you know, is another thing entirely. But then you have King's Ransom, which is where we get the coin from, and there is when Richard I was captured on his way back from the Crusades, and that's where we get the term King's Ransom from, is when he was captured. It was an extortionate sum demanded of England for his return. That's the type of thing that's going on here. And again, if the king has absolute power, you know, he needed to rely on all other people to basically bail him out of that. He couldn't do that himself, which meant that, you know, although we like to think of the kings being as this supreme kind of absolute power authoritarian beings, sometimes they were, but most of the times they had that power in premise, but in reality, in order to wield that power, they needed the support of the people beneath them in order to do so.
And eventually contributed to the formation of the Magna Carta. The Hundred Years' War, a few centuries later between France and England, similarly led to political reforms as a result of the negotiations necessary to maintain the conflict.
I know I've just unpaused it, but it's mentioned Magna Carta again. I just want to go into it a little bit. So, obviously, I'm not going to go too deeply in it because otherwise I'll be here all day. I've actually seen the official seal as well of the Magna Carta when it was signed in one of the archives. That was really cool. It's really significant. I think it's one of the most influential pieces of legislature in the world. Particularly in my own country, as we don't actually have a written constitution. England or Britain has an unwritten constitution, and so there's a lot of people that state that our constitution technically goes back to 1215 when the Magna Carta was signed. And for those of you who don't know, who perhaps aren't English or perhaps don't really know what the Magna Carta is about, is, long story short, it's essentially a kind of almost like a Bill of Rights to an extent. It put, in theory, limits on the power of the king, as well as if you was a freeman, you had trial by jury, which means you couldn't just be, killed or sent to prison for no reason. You actually had to have a proper trial. Not if you was a common man. These didn't count if you was a peasant or something like that. This was just freeman above, but still it was a start. As well as you had the council barons, so it would be like the king couldn't do things without consulting 25 barons. And, so that would be things like taxation. He couldn't raise taxation without consulting the 25 barons. And a lot of people suggest that this council of 25 barons would be kind of the de facto first English parliament, so to speak. And although it kind of got altered and ignored by some kings, particularly, as I said, in King John's case, when he ignored it, that was a massive contributing factor to the First Barons' War. The Magna Carta kind of set the ball rolling for recognising some basic kind of rights for people, for its citizens, and I feel like for that reason it's a really significant piece of historical legislature.
But after months of preparation, let's say the decision has finally been made to go to war. What now? Well, their next step was the call to arms. This basically amounted to telling all relevant parties that it was go time. Generally, an initial notice would be sent to key officials and aristocrats, declaring the leader's intentions and justifying the decision to go to war with the necessary political messaging. These would be delivered by couriers who travelled on foot, on horseback, by boat, or by wing in the case of messenger birds. One must imagine such a process taking at least a week or two to reach its intended recipients. After the initial message, an official summons would be issued to alert the crown's vassals and other important figures as to the specifics of their military obligations. Details would include a date and location for the army to muster. These individuals would in turn send out messages to their own vassals and dependents. The process would repeat until it had reached the local level, usually through a system of public cry, whereby heralds would ride out to make announcements in village squares and marketplaces. This call to arms required significant time, not only to account for travel, but also for provisions to be gathered, equipment to be purchased or refurbished, and contracts to be worked out.
Given that a pause there, because the mustering and things like this would be where, if you've seen again Game of Thrones, when Robb calls the banners and you see the messenger birds fly out, obviously not that many birds might necessarily be pulled out, or it wouldn't just be messenger birds, or as they said in Lord of the Rings, muster the Rohirrim, and then he addresses his the various kind of the Earls of the Riddermark and stuff like that to ride out and basically gather as many men, and then in a certain number of days they'll meet at this place and then march to war type thing. And obviously, again, these are kind of fictitious, they probably over-exaggerate how quickly these things can happen, but the general idea is there that once war was declared, or once a war was going to happen, obviously, an entire country, you need to gather your men together, because they're not just chilling all the time. You don't have military bases necessarily in the way that we do now. They had to message out to the vassals, and then the vassals had vassals, and then their vassals had vassals, and then collectively they come together. And again, if there was a campaign happening and you was called up, you could again also substitute depending on your circumstance. So if you was a knight, if you earned, I think it was below £20, you could substitute somebody in your place. And again, you'd have to pay a certain fee in order to, basically fund that. But generally speaking, if a general marshal came out and you were financially able and you refused the call, then that was grounds for you to be imprisoned. Certainly in England, I don't know how it works in the continent, but in particularly, I think it was between the 12th and the 14th century, I believe, if a general marshal came out and you was financially able and you didn't arrive or didn't turn up, then you could be imprisoned as a result of that, and perhaps even in extreme cases your lands and titles stripped of you for that reason. But it takes a long amount of time, and again, it's the boring part of history that people don't necessarily like to talk about, but logistics plays a huge role. It's not just getting the men, as I said, it's getting everything. Particularly in England as well, there used to be stockpiles. So at strategic places around the country, there used to be kind of almost like these massive great towers that were kind of kept or maintenance by the various sheriffs of the different counties. And within these kind of great towers or great kind of caches would be bow staves, it would be arrows, it would be quivers, saddles, even lances, where it had been made all in bulk in preparation for a campaign. And then that meant around the country there was various different kind of cache points that, as an army was on the go, it could go and pass these cache points, pick up their bow staves or their quivers of arrows or various things, and take that with them on the march, which is a really quite smart idea when you think about it. But again, logistics, the boring part of history that nobody really wants to talk about, but it plays a vital role in practically every conflict that's ever existed.
William the Conqueror issued a call to arms in 1072 for the purposes of launching a campaign into Scotland. He gave his men 8 weeks to assemble. When Henry V made his preparations for the famed Agincourt campaign in 1415, his forces were largely raised through contracts of indenture, which were formally issued in late April, with an intended date of arrival within 2 months. Now that the word was out amongst the general public, let's move on to talk about the response to the call to arms. The mustering of the troops would have varied greatly by region and time period. However, we can provide some idea of what this looked like by applying this process to the typical medieval army we mentioned previously. Of these, the quickest and most reliable to muster would be the retinue of the social elite, and were already close at hand when the call to arms came in. Such troops were generally well-equipped and trained forces of heavy cavalry, infantry, and archers, and thus constituted an important part of a medieval army. A king's personal retinue might number in the hundreds or even thousands of soldiers, while lesser nobles further down the hierarchy might only be able to call on a handful of men. Retinues became increasingly professionalized over the course of the Middle Ages and would often be supplemented in times of war by subcontracting with smaller companies of professional soldiers. In England, these arrangements would be called contracts of indenture and would eventually be issued for the whole army in the late medieval period.
Yeah, so essentially kind of military contracts. And again, I just want to touch on, so these people, the aristocrats, would be kind of like the first people that I spoke about earlier in the video. These would be the people who are wealthy, can afford their own weapons and armor and things like that. And then they have their people underneath them, their own household that they look after, that they arm, that they armor. And as he said, the very top, your barons, your kings and stuff like that might have retinues that go into the thousands and the hundreds, all of which you provide for and look after and type of things. But the lower down the ladder that you go, the less kind of people that they bring. So for example, a king might have an earl as his vassal, and he might be able to bring, a few score of his men, maybe 50 or so. But then that earl might have a vassal beneath him, and he himself might only be able to, say, bring himself and about 5 men that he can arm and armor himself. And those men usually come from the fiefs in which that minor nobility kind of runs or has kind of an overseeing of. So that's kind of how the aristocratic works. And then I assume we're going into freemen.
The next major group to muster would be the non-aristocratic freemen, who assembled as part of a levy or militia unit. These were quite common institutions, especially in urban population centres. Most regions and cities across Europe had some form of obligated military service for freemen, and even required them to possess weaponry suitable for their level of income. However, these obligations were not intended as a general draft for military service in offensive field armies, but rather as a tool for local defense and peacekeeping. In 14th century France, for example, when the king made his call to arms in the face of an English invasion, towns had to make a payment in money or bodies proportional to their wealth and size. A well-off community, for instance, might have to supply one soldier for each 100 hearths, while a poorer village only supplied one soldier for each 200 hearths. Rulers, such as Edward I of England, sometimes attempted to expand these obligations into a larger form of military service that would provide infantry for field armies, but these groups were typically smaller. Finding troops eligible to serve in them was often difficult, as the most capable soldiers had already found other employment. The last major group to mention in our muster are the auxiliary forces. These might have been made up of hired professional forces, mercenaries, and foreign allies. The line between these groups can be hard to define, given the many forms of military service in the medieval period. Generally, though, these types of soldiers might be acquired as part of political treaties and alliances, or might be hired from groups of free companies, as was the case in 14th century Italy. Such forces could be quite efficient in mustering, given the incentives of paid service, but there might be a substantial lag time for negotiation and transport.
Yeah, and so mercenaries, again, I'm sorry to hark back to kind of Game of Thrones and things like this. For those of you who've watched Game of Thrones or have read A Song of Ice and Fire, things like that, you have sellsword companies. And although that's kind of fictitious and a bit kind of fantastical, it gives you an idea that you had mercenary companies. And most mercenary companies weren't kind of permanent institutions. They popped up for a temporary amount of time with men for a campaign or a war or something like that, and they kind of dispersed. Fixed mercenary companies wasn't something that necessarily was the norm. However, they still existed. Probably the most famous I can think of is probably the White Company in the 14th century, led by John Hartwood. And again, after Poitiers, he kind of joined the White Company and eventually kind of became a major part in that, and they served with distinction in the various wars between the Italian city-states. And again, they're efficient in mustering. They're usually quite efficient in general because their trade is killing. However, there was kind of suspicious individuals at the time, and that's not just a modern recollection. It's because, if your job is violence, then it's a little bit dodgy. In that sense, you kill people for money. But also there were several occasions where mercenaries would flip-flop between the highest bidder. So, for a certain time they'll be on one side, and then the opposing side would offer them better pay, and then suddenly they'd reverse their targets, if you will. So that's a bit thing there. But obviously, again, negotiation. You're not dealing with citizens here, you're dealing with mercenaries. So whoever wants to hire these mercenaries, there's a lot of individual kind of bartering and debating over what the price is going to be for that specific service or that specific campaign that they're going to be involved in.
Throughout the mustering period, one can therefore expect all kinds of activity taking place. Small groups would assemble on the local level and proceed towards the main rally point, gathering into larger groups along the way for the sake of organisation, discipline, and mutual protection. Once at the muster point, the commanders of a force would have to present themselves to a royal official to be officially counted and assigned a position in the army. This was an important process, as there was really no way of knowing exactly how many people would show up. Once registered at the muster, soldiers would camp along with the larger host and wait for the assembly of forces to finish. Due to the amalgamated nature of medieval armies, rulers attempted to maintain discipline by issuing ordinances that prohibited insults, brawling, and other conflicts that could disrupt the cohesion of the army. This encampment would usually be located near a port or a border territory for easier movement once the army was finally on the march. How the army moved to the area where they would fight was dependent on geography. Land wars were fairly straightforward, and an army would often simply march there. Wars overseas were more complicated and required the use of naval transports, as might be the case for an English expedition to the continent or armies going on crusade to the Holy Land. However, medieval states did not maintain large purpose-built navies, and they would have to either impress merchant ships for military purposes or pay significant expenses to hire ships for transporting the army. The logistic requirements of an army were enormous, not only from the army itself, but also from the large number of support personnel, camp followers, and animals that accompanied medieval armies. War horses, pack animals, and livestock brought for food all required enormous quantities of forage themselves. The efforts of medieval commanders to meet this logistical demand by requisitioning supplies and transport under royal authority often proved politically unpopular. When embarking or in friendly territory, medieval armies did their best to remain together and retain a sense of organization. On campaign in enemy territories, medieval armies tended to spread out to scout, forage, and raid. Small units as large as 200 or 300 would break off from the main army to gather supplies and loot villages. These raiding and foraging actions were extremely brutal for local civilians caught in the path of marching armies, even when some rulers attempted to limit the damage that their armies inflicted for political purposes. When the army was approaching its main target or a large enemy force, it would once again reconsolidate and prepare for battle. However, discussions of this stage of medieval warfare will have to wait for another time. We hope you've appreciated this in-depth look at how to raise a medieval army. Stay tuned for more exciting videos on ancient warfare. But you can continue.
Okay, is this just an advert? Yeah, that seems like an advert. Okay, so yeah, so that's how to raise a medieval army. So I found that quite interesting. There were some things that I didn't entirely know all the way through, and so I've learned them from there, and hopefully you guys have learned a little bit from that as well. I find it really interesting. I find the whole medieval period and kind of medieval warfare really kind of interesting as well. And a bit like what I said there, once in enemy territory, armies would split up and kind of raid and scout and all things like this happen. And that's why in wars and things like this, that was kind of the majority of combat, if you will, like various skirmishing parties or raiding parties meeting each other and fighting, or a raiding party meets a town guard rather than the pitched battle themselves. But yeah, and again, as it said, with the fodder and all the hangers on and stuff like that, getting equipment for them, again, logistics is the boring part of war. You know, even now it's kind of the boring part of war, but yeah, it's important. It's incredibly important to kind of the success of fighting and success of units in there. But I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you've learned something. And again, as I said, with this kind of Crusader Kings 2 advert playing here, if you're interested in me doing any type of gaming or virtual content or stuff like that, whether that be Hoi, whether that be things like Total War series or things like this, and kind of try and make them more edited, kind of humorous type videos, or even like kind of community game nights or something like that, if you would be up for something like that, then please let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed. Please stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye bye.